She stood trembling in the grand foyer, a heavy-set human girl clutching a positive pregnancy test, hoping the ancient vampire king she loved would finally show his heart. Instead, he laughed, his fangs catching the chandelier's light, and threw her out into the freezing Boston rain. "A creature like you could never bear my heirs," he sneered, turning his back. 5 years later, the heavy oak doors of his empire burst open. She's back, and she brought the twin terrors he never knew existed. Penelope Higgins was not the kind of woman who belonged in the gilded, blood-soaked halls of the Beacon Hill elite. She was 24, standing at 5'4", and weighing a soft, undeniable 250 pounds. She had thick thighs, a heavy stomach that pressed against the constraints of her velvet dress, and a face that was sweet rather than strikingly immortal. In the world of vampires, where perfection was frozen in time and companions were typically gaunt, ethereal beauties with translucent skin, Penelope was an anomaly. She was fiercely human, and for the past 2 years she had been the secret obsession of Nathaniel Croft. Nathaniel was the undisputed king of the Eastern Seaboard, the CEO of Croft Biogenetics, and a predator whose cruelty was as legendary as his wealth. Behind closed doors, in the suffocating darkness of his penthouse, he had worshipped Penelope's softness. He had traced the stretch marks on her hips, as if they were constellations drinking from her veins, and burying his face in her thick dark hair. He made her believe that the rules of his kind did not apply to them. He made her believe she was his. But daylight always brings a brutal reality. It was the night of the Winter Solstice Gala, the most important event in the vampire high society. Penelope had spent a month's salary on a deep crimson gown, hoping to finally step out of the shadows. More importantly, she had a secret burning in her chest. Her period was 6 weeks late. A home test confirmed by a secretive blood panel run by her friend lab technician Sarah Jenkins at Massachusetts General Hospital had revealed the impossible: Penelope was pregnant. Human vampire pregnancies were dismissed as biological myths, fairy tales told to keep human donors compliant. Yet the impossible was currently growing inside her womb. Clutching her beaded purse, Penelope slipped past the heavy security detail and entered the grand ballroom of the Croft estate. The air was thick with the scent of copper and expensive perfume. Immortal eyes snapped toward her. Laughter died in the throats of centuries-old aristocrats. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of their judgment. They looked at her fleshy arms and the curve of her belly with unapologetic disgust. "Look at the human," a voice sneered from the velvet-draped balcony. Did she wander away from the feeding pens? Penelope kept her chin high, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto him. Nathaniel. He stood by the roaring fireplace, looking like a dark god in a tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. But he wasn't alone. Clinging to his arm was Victoria Laurent, a stunning, rail-thin vampire heiress whose family controlled the European covens. Taking a deep breath, Penelope pushed through the crowd. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the sudden hush. "I need to speak with you, privately." Nathaniel's icy blue eyes hardened into obsidian. The warmth he showed her in the dark was entirely absent. He looked at her as if she were a stain on his imported rugs. "You have crossed a line, Penelope. You do not belong here." "Please," she whispered, stepping closer, desperately wanting him to see the truth in her eyes. "It's important. It's about us. I'm carrying your—" "Silence!" Nathaniel's voice echoed like a thunderclap, vibrating the crystal glasses on the tables. He closed the distance between them in a blur of motion, his hand wrapping brutally around her upper arm. His grip was a vice, bruising her soft flesh instantly. "There is no us. You are a donor, a temporary indulgence. Did you truly believe your mundane, undisciplined body was fit to stand beside a king?" The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. Victoria laughed, a high, tinkling sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Nathaniel, the poor fat thing thinks she's your equal. How tragic. Look at her, she's practically spilling out of that cheap fabric." Tears pricked Penelope's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I am pregnant, Nathaniel." She forced the words out, breathless, desperate. "With your children." The ballroom erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. Nathaniel's face twisted in absolute revulsion. He didn't check her pulse. He didn't listen for the tiny, rapid heartbeats fluttering inside her. His pride and the sheer impossibility of her claim blinded him. "A biological impossibility." Nathaniel spat his fangs, extending slightly in his rage. "And even if it were possible, I would never allow my bloodline to be tainted by a weak, pathetic creature like you. You disgust me." He didn't just break her heart, he shattered her entire reality. Nathaniel dragged her by the arm, humiliated, and stumbling through the parting crowd of jeering vampires. He pulled her to the heavy mahogany front doors, and with a terrifying shove, he threw her out onto the stone steps. Penelope hit the freezing rain-slicked pavement hard, scraping her knees and tearing the crimson velvet of her dress. The freezing Boston winter bit into her skin instantly. "If I ever see your face in my city again," Nathaniel stood in the doorway, a silhouette of absolute cruelty. "I will not be so merciful. You are banished." The heavy doors slammed shut, echoing with finality. Penelope sat in the freezing rain, shivering violently. She wrapped her thick arms around her stomach, curling inward to protect the tiny lives growing inside her. The man she loved was a monster. He had discarded her because of her humanity, because of her size, because of his pride. But as the icy water soaked through her clothes, a new fiery resolve ignited in her chest. She was fat, yes. She was human, yes. But she was not weak. She hauled herself up from the pavement, the rain mixing with her tears. "I will survive this," she whispered to the empty, dark street. "And you will never touch them." She turned her back on the Beacon Hill estate and walked into the storm, disappearing from Nathaniel Croft's world. Surviving a vampire pregnancy as a human was a brutal, agonizing ordeal. Penelope fled across the country to Seattle, Washington, losing herself in the perpetual gray rain where vampires rarely hunted. She found work as an administrative clerk at Harborview Medical Center, burying her past under stacks of patient files. The pregnancy ravaged her. The babies demanded iron, protein, and blood. Her already heavy body expanded, but not with the typical glow of a mother-to-be. She became dangerously anemic. It was only through the quiet, off-the-books intervention of Dr. Richard Caldwell, a seasoned human hematologist who had seen the dark underbelly of the supernatural world, that she survived. Dr. Caldwell monitored her in secret, providing her with the necessary transfusions to keep the voracious twins from draining her life force. When the twins were born, it was a chaotic, bloody miracle. Leo and Maya, they looked entirely human, with Penelope's dark hair and soft, rounded facial features, but their eyes held the terrifying, icy blue hue of their father. Over the next 5 years, Penelope did not magically lose weight. The trauma, the stress, and the sheer physical demand of raising half-vampire twins meant she remained a heavily built, fat woman. But the timid, desperate girl who had begged on Nathaniel's doorstep was dead. In her place stood a fierce, unapologetic mother. She dressed in sharp, structured blazers, carried herself with unyielding authority, and guarded her children with the ferocity of a lioness. Leo and Maya were extraordinary. They were faster than normal children, incredibly strong, and possessed a chilling intellect. But as they approached their 5th birthday, a terrifying problem emerged. Their hybrid bodies began rejecting regular human food and standard medical blood bags. They were experiencing cellular breakdown. "There is only one synthesized hemoglobin variant that can stabilize their mutation," Dr. Caldwell told Penelope gravely, in his dimly lit office, pushing a medical file across the desk. "It's an experimental peptide matrix, and there is only one facility in the world that manufactures it." Penelope looked at the logo on the file, a sleek silver double helix wrapped around a crimson drop. Croft Biogenetics, Boston. Her blood ran cold. "No," she whispered. "I can't go back there. He will kill me. Or worse, he will take them. If you don't get them this formula, Penelope, they will not survive the year," Caldwell said softly. "You don't have to announce yourself. The clinic in downtown Boston processes thousands of pediatric patients for rare blood disorders. Go in, enroll them in the trial under a pseudonym, get the synthetic supply, and leave." It was a terrifying gamble, but for her children, Penelope would walk into hell itself. 2 weeks later, the Boston sky was overcast as Penelope stepped out of the taxi in front of the Croft Biogenetics Pediatric Research Center. She held Leo's hand in her left and Maya's in her right. She wore a tailored charcoal trench coat that wrapped securely around her wide hips, her dark hair pinned back in a severe, elegant twist. She looked like a woman of substance, a woman who commanded respect. The clinic lobby was a marvel of sterile, terrifying efficiency. White marble, silver accents, and security personnel whose stillness betrayed their undead nature. Penelope felt the familiar, suffocating aura of vampires, but she kept her breathing even. She walked directly to the reception desk. "Appointment for Higgins? Dr. Aris's clinical trial?" Penelope said firmly to the receptionist, a young woman whose pale skin marked her as a thrall. "Please take a seat. The doctor will call you shortly," the receptionist murmured, barely glancing up. Penelope guided her twins to a secluded corner of the waiting area. Maya was idly bending a solid metal paperclip into perfect, intricate origami shapes, while Leo was staring unblinkingly at a security guard across the room, tracking the guard's unnaturally fast micro-movements. "Keep your heads down," Penelope whispered to them. "We get the medicine, and we go home. Suddenly, the ambient temperature in the room plummeted. The low murmur of the clinic ceased entirely. Penelope's heart slammed against her ribs. She recognized that heavy, suffocating power, the kind of power that made the air feel like deep water. The glass elevator doors slid open, and a contingent of executives stepped out into the lobby. Leading them was a man whose presence devoured the light in the room, Nathaniel Croft. He looked exactly the same as he had 5 years ago, immaculate, lethal, and devastatingly cold. He was conducting a surprise inspection of the facility, his sharp eyes scanning the room, analyzing every detail. Penelope froze. She instinctively moved to shield the twins, with her large body turning her back toward the lobby, praying to a god she wasn't sure existed, that Nathaniel would just walk past. But Maya, ever curious, slipped from behind her mother's wide frame. A heavy metal medical cart, carelessly left by a nurse, began to roll down the slanted ramp of the hallway, picking up speed. It was heading directly for a fragile human toddler standing nearby. Before Penelope could grab her, Maya moved. She didn't run, she blurred. In a fraction of a second, the 5-year-old girl stood between the toddler and the cart. Maya raised one small, pale hand and caught the 200-pound metal cart dead in its tracks. The metal crumpled slightly under her tiny grip. The entire lobby gasped. The silence that followed was deafening. Nathaniel stopped dead in his tracks, his icy blue eyes locked onto the little girl, displaying impossible supernatural strength in broad daylight. Slowly, his gaze dragged upward from Maya, past the dented cart, until it landed squarely on the broad, familiar back of the woman desperately trying to pull the child away. Penelope turned around, her face pale, but her jaw set in stone. Across the expansive marble floor, her eyes met Nathaniel's. He felt the breath leave his lungs. He stared at her face, fuller now, but unmistakably hers. And then he looked at the little girl and the little boy stepping out from behind her coat. 2 children with his exact, piercing blue eyes. The impossible heirs he had banished to the snow. The silence in the clinic lobby was thick enough to choke on. Time seemed to fracture, stretching the seconds into agonizing hours, as Nathaniel Croft stared at the impossible scene before him. The crushed metal of the 200-pound medical cart lay dented on the pristine marble floor, still caught in the tiny, pale hand of a 5-year-old girl. Nathaniel's gaze shifted from the ruined metal to the child's face. Maya's dark hair fell in soft waves, framing a face that was strikingly human, yet her eyes, those piercing, terrifyingly familiar, ice-blue eyes, were entirely his. Beside her stood the boy Leo, his small jaw set in a rigid line of defiance that mirrored the ancient vampire king's own legendary temper. Then Nathaniel looked at the woman shielding them, Penelope. She had not shrunk away in the years since he had thrown her into the freezing Boston snow. If anything, she seemed to take up more space, her heavy, soft frame commanding the room with an imposing maternal gravity. The charcoal trench coat she wore clung to her wide hips and broad shoulders, acting as armor. She was heavily built, unapologetically fat, and fiercely planted between the absolute ruler of the eastern seaboard and her children. In a fraction of a second, Nathaniel crossed the expansive lobby. He moved with a speed that blurred the air, stopping mere inches from Penelope. The sudden drop in temperature was violent, frosting the edges of the glass reception desk. "You?" Nathaniel breathed, his voice a dangerous velvet rasp that vibrated in Penelope's chest. The scent of him, cedar-cold night air, and raw power flooded her senses, bringing back a sickening wave of forgotten intimacy and sharp betrayal. Penelope did not flinch. She squared her broad shoulders, her thick body forming a solid wall against him. "Do not come any closer, Nathaniel." Nathaniel ignored her warning. His eyes darted down to the twins who were peering around their mother's waist. He felt a violent primal shockwave tear through his undead heart. The impossible scent of them hit him, a blend of human warmth and the distinct, unmistakable metallic tang of his own ancient bloodline. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "What game are you playing, Penelope?" "No games," Penelope said, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic pounding of her heart against her ribs. She tightened her grip on her children's hands, pulling them tighter against her thick thighs. "We are here for a medical appointment, that is all." Nathaniel's fangs descended slightly, grazing his lower lip. He looked at Maya, who was still staring at him with eerie, unblinking calm. She stopped a moving cart. "A human child would be a smear on this marble. They have my eyes. They have my blood." He stepped closer, crowding Penelope's space, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over her. "You lied to me." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Penelope's lips. She tilted her chin up, forcing him to look at her round, flushed face. "I lied to you. Do you remember the winter solstice gala? Nathaniel, I stood in front of your entire court, humiliated, spilling out of my dress, and told you the truth. You called it a biological impossibility. You called me a weak, pathetic creature. You threw me into the rain and told me I was banished. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. The memory of her weeping on the stone steps flashed behind his eyes. He had been so certain of his reality, so blinded by his immortal arrogance, that he had discarded the only true miracle his bloodline had produced in a millennium. "They are mine," Nathaniel stated, the possessive instinct of a predator roaring to life inside him. He reached out his pale hand, moving toward Leo. Before his fingers could brush the boy's dark hair, Penelope shoved Nathaniel. It was a foolish, suicidal move for a human to put her hands on a vampire king, but Penelope threw her entire 250-pound weight into the push. To the absolute shock of the watching executives and security guards, Nathaniel actually took a half step back. "They belong to no one but me," Penelope snarled, her brown eyes blazing with a ferocity that momentarily stunned him. "You gave up any right to them the night you left us to die in the storm. We survived without you." A low, dangerous growl rumbled in Nathaniel's chest. The executives in the lobby instantly dropped to their knees, bowing their heads in submission to their king's rising wrath. The human staff trembled in sheer terror. "Shut down the building," Nathaniel commanded over his shoulder, never breaking eye contact with Penelope. "Lock down every exit. No one leaves." "Nathaniel, no!" Penelope started, panic finally bleeding into her voice. "You brought them into my territory." Nathaniel interrupted, his voice returning to that terrifying, calm authority. "Did you honestly think I would let you walk out the front door? You are coming with me, upstairs, now." Penelope's mind raced. Her maternal instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to tear through the security detail with her bare hands if she had to. But then she looked down at Leo. The boy's skin was incredibly pale and there was a faint tremor in his small hands. The cellular breakdown. They were out of time. "Only if you bring Dr. Heirs to your office," Penelope bargained, her voice hard, negotiating with the devil himself. "And the experimental peptide matrix. They are sick, Nathaniel. Their bodies are rejecting standard blood. If you don't give them the synthesized hemoglobin right now, your so-called heirs won't live to see the end of the week." Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly, the information calculating in his ancient mind. The hybrid mutation was unstable. Without another word, he turned on his heel. "Bring the head of hematology to the penthouse suite," he snapped to his second in command. He gestured toward the private gold-trimmed elevator at the back of the lobby. "Walk, Penelope, before I lose what little patience I have left." Wrapping her arms protectively around the shoulders of her twins, Penelope began the heavy walk toward the elevator. Every eye in the lobby was fixed on her wide back, on the fat human woman who had just defied the King of the East and lived. The cage doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing them inside a suffocating silence as they began the ascent into Nathaniel's gilded fortress. The penthouse medical suite of Croft Biogenetics was a masterpiece of sterile opulence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the grey, churning waters of Boston Harbor, while the interior was outfitted with medical equipment more advanced than any human hospital on Earth. Penelope sat rigidly on a plush white leather sofa, her heavy thighs pressed tightly together. She had refused to take off her trench coat. It felt like her only armor in this den of predators. Maya and Leo sat on either side of her, their small hands clutching the thick fabric of her coat. Across the room, standing by the steel examination table, was Dr. Arthur Pendleton. He was an ancient vampire, his skin like parchment, but his eyes were bright with terrifying scientific curiosity. He had just finished analyzing the blood samples taken from the twins. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back rigid, his reflection in the glass a portrait of barely contained violence. He was waiting for the verdict. "It is utterly fascinating, my sire," Dr. Pendleton whispered, staring at the glowing monitors. "The genetic sequence is a perfect 50-50 split. The mother's human DNA has provided a flexible cellular structure, while your immortal genome has infused them with accelerated cellular regeneration and strength. However, get to the point, Arthur," Nathaniel snapped, turning around. Dr. Pendleton cleared his throat. The human mother was correct. The immortal cells are effectively cannibalizing the human cells for sustenance. They are starving on a microscopic level. Standard human blood cannot satiate the immortal side, and vampire blood would overload their fragile human organs. The synthesized peptide matrix, the project we deemed a commercial failure, is the exact perfect bridge they need. Penelope let out a shaky breath, burying her face in her hands. She had been right. Dr. Caldwell had been right. "Administer it," Nathaniel ordered. "Now." Dr. Pendleton moved swiftly, preparing 2 specialized IV drips, filled with a glowing ruby-red synthetic liquid. Penelope moved to the medical cots, her large frame hovering protectively as the needles were inserted into her children's small arms. Within minutes, the color began to return to Leo's cheeks. The faint tremor in his hands vanished. Maya sighed, her body relaxing into the pillows. Nathaniel watched the scene from the shadows. For the first time in 5 years, he truly looked at Penelope. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her mouth and the sheer, solid mass of her body that she used like a shield. She hadn't come to Boston to win him back. She hadn't come to demand child support or royal titles. She had walked directly into the stronghold of the monster who broke her, risking her own life entirely for the sake of these children. A strange, unfamiliar tightness gripped Nathaniel's chest. Respect. It was a terrifying realization. They will require a constant supply of the matrix, Dr. Pendleton noted, adjusting the IV lines. Weekly infusions until their biology stabilizes, which could take years. Then they will remain here, Nathaniel declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Prepare the east wing of the estate. They are Croft heirs. They will be raised with the wealth, protection, and status that my bloodline demands. Penelope snapped her head up. Absolutely not. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. You are in no position to dictate terms, Penelope. They need my facility to live, ergo they belong to me now. Penelope stood up, her broad chest heaving. They are Higgins. They are my children. I am the one who bled for them. I am the one who nearly died giving birth to them while you were playing king with your skeletal European heiresses. We will take the matrix and we will leave. You will not take another step outside this building, Nathaniel said, closing the distance between them. He looked down at her, his voice dropping to a lethal purr. Do not push me, Penelope. You are fat, human, and fragile. I could snap your neck before you could draw your next breath. The only reason you are still breathing is because they need a mother. Penelope tilted her head back, meeting his icy stare without a flinch. Then do it, she whispered fiercely. Kill me, but know that if you do, your children will hate you for eternity. They will know exactly what kind of monster their father is. Before Nathaniel could respond to her terrifying bluff, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse suite swung open. The sound of sharp stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Penelope's stomach plummeted as a familiar, sickly sweet scent filled the room. Victoria Laurent stepped into the medical suite. She was as flawless and horrifying as she had been 5 years ago. Tall, impossibly thin, dressed in a sleek white designer suit that highlighted her gaunt, high-fashion perfection. She was currently Nathaniel's closest political ally, and according to the tabloids of the underworld, his soon-to-be queen. Victoria stopped, her blood-red lips parting in shock as she took in the scene. She looked at the two children hooked up to IVs, bearing Nathaniel's exact eyes. Then her gaze shifted with agonizing slowness to Penelope. A sneer of absolute, unadulterated disgust twisted Victoria's perfect face. By the dark gods! Victoria laughed, a cruel, ringing sound. The rumors from the lobby were true. The little fat pig from the Solstice Gala crawled back. She looked Penelope up and down, her eyes lingering on her wide waistline and heavy thighs. And it looks like you've only gotten larger. Tell me, human, did you eat a bakery before you decided to come beg for a handout? Penelope felt the heat rise to her cheeks, the old humiliation threatening to drown her. But before she could open her mouth to defend herself, a terrifying shift occurred in the room. Nathaniel stepped directly in front of Penelope, placing his broad back to her, shielding her entirely from Victoria's view. The air in the room didn't just drop in temperature. It became volatile, oppressive, crackling with dark, lethal energy. Watch your mouth, Victoria! Nathaniel snarled, his voice a demonic echo that shook the glass windows. You are speaking to the mother of my heirs. Victoria froze, her smirk melting into a mask of pure shock. Penelope stared at Nathaniel's back, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The king who had banished her for her size was now standing between her and the world. But as Nathaniel turned his head slightly, his icy blue eyes locking onto Penelope's, she realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't protecting her out of love. He was protecting his property. The cage door had just slammed shut, and Penelope Higgins was trapped in a nightmare far worse than the cold Boston streets. The east wing of the Croft estate was a sprawling, opulent fortress designed to keep the world out. But to Penelope Higgins, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. The walls were lined with centuries-old silk tapestries. The floors were imported Italian marble, and the heavy mahogany doors locked from the outside. For the past 3 weeks, Penelope and her twins had been confined to this extravagant prison, living under the suffocating, watchful eye of Nathaniel Croft. Penelope refused to shrink into the background of Nathaniel's dark, intimidating world. The estate staff, a mix of human thralls and lesser vampires, had initially looked at her with thinly veiled disdain. They were accustomed to serving ethereal skeletal beauties who glided through the halls like ghosts. Penelope, with her heavy footfalls, thick thighs, and broad shoulders, disrupted their perfect immortal aesthetic. When Nathaniel's elite tailors had arrived with racks of size 0 designer gowns, assuming she would want to magically transform herself or hide her body in flowing, shapeless sacks, Penelope had sent them away. Instead, she ordered her own clothes. She wore sharply tailored plus-size power suits in deep plums, rich emeralds, and stark blacks. She took up space. She let her hips sway as she walked, her chin held high, radiating a maternal, grounded authority that none of the undead creatures knew how to handle. She was fat human, and the mother of their future kings. She demanded respect, and terrifyingly she was getting it. Nathaniel, however, was a different battle entirely. Dinner had become a nightly war. The massive mahogany dining table was set for 4. Nathaniel sat at the head, radiating cold, ancient authority. Penelope sat at the opposite end, a physical barrier between him and the twins, who sat safely near her elbows. "They need to begin combat training," Nathaniel stated one evening, slicing into a piece of rare steak. He didn't need to eat human food, but he did it to assert a semblance of normalcy or dominance. "Maya's raw strength is undisciplined. Leo's speed is erratic. I have arranged for my personal guard to begin their instruction tomorrow at midnight." Penelope set her fork down with a sharp clink. "Absolutely not. They are 5 years old, Nathaniel. They go to bed at 8 o'clock, and their current curriculum involves finger painting and learning how to share not hand-to-hand combat with undead assassins." Nathaniel's icy blue eyes snapped to hers, the temperature in the dining room plummeting. "They are not ordinary human children, Penelope. They are Croft heirs. The underworld already whispers of their existence. If they do not know how to kill, they will be killed." "And whose fault is that?" Penelope shot back, leaning forward, her large chest pressing against the table. "They wouldn't be in danger if you hadn't locked us in this museum of horrors. You will not turn my children into your little soldiers. They will have a childhood." Before Nathaniel could unleash the furious retort burning in his throat, a silver fork suddenly bent completely backward. Maya, who had been quietly eating her mashed potatoes, was glaring at her father. Her small face was scrunched in anger, and the heavy silver cutlery in her hand had warped under the sheer force of her supernatural temper. "Don't yell at Mommy," Maya said, her voice eerily calm, though her ice-blue eyes glowed with a predatory light. Nathaniel stared at his daughter. The ancient vampire king, who had slaughtered armies and brought covens to their knees, found himself entirely paralyzed by the protective fury of a 5-year-old girl. He looked from Maya to Penelope, recognizing the same unbreakable will in both of them. He slowly lowered his hands. "Very well, we will postpone the combat training." Penelope offered a tight, victorious nod. She had won the battle, but she knew the war was far from over. The true danger in the estate wasn't Nathaniel's overbearing nature. It was the quiet, venomous presence of Victoria Laurent. Though Nathaniel had publicly claimed the twins, Victoria still roamed the estate as if she owned it, her status as Nathaniel's political fiancée unrevoked. The confrontation happened 2 days later in the East Wing Gardens. Penelope was sitting on a stone bench, watching Leo and Maya chase each other through the manicured hedges. She wore a heavy knit cardigan that wrapped comfortably around her wide waist, enjoying the rare afternoon sun. "It's almost comedic watching you pretend you belong here," a sickly sweet voice purred. Penelope didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head to see Victoria leaning against a marble statue, dressed in a skin-tight scarlet dress that clung to her hollow, jutting hip bones. Victoria looked like a high-fashion predator, all sharp angles and cold malice. "Victoria," Penelope said evenly, "I thought this wing was restricted." "I go where I please, little human," Victoria sneered, pushing off the statue and slowly circling Penelope. She eyed Penelope's heavy, soft body with overt disgust. "I must admit, I am baffled. I understand the biological fluke of the children, but I cannot fathom how Nathaniel ever brought himself to touch you in the first place. All this flesh, it's revolting. You look like a farm animal that wandered into a palace." 5 years ago, those words would have broken Penelope. She would have cried, tried to hide her body and run away. Now Penelope just laughed. It was a rich, genuine sound that echoed in the quiet garden. Victoria stopped, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "You find your own grotesque nature amusing? I find your insecurity amusing," Penelope said, standing up. She was significantly shorter than Victoria, but her sheer mass and broad shoulders made her an immovable object against the vampire's brittle frame. Penelope stepped right into Victoria's personal space. "You have starved yourself for 3 centuries to achieve some twisted version of perfection. You have status, wealth, and immortality, and yet the King of the East chose my grotesque human body over your perfect immortal one. He buried himself in my flesh, and my blood gave him the one thing your dead hollow womb never could, a legacy." Victoria's pale face contorted in absolute fury, her fangs snapping down. She raised a hand to strike her nails, sharpening into claws. "Do it," Penelope whispered fiercely, her brown eyes blazing. "Strike the mother of the heirs. See what Nathaniel does to you. See what my children do to you. At the mention of the twins, Victoria hesitated, her eyes darting toward the hedges where Maya was now standing watching them. The little girl had effortlessly ripped a thick oak branch from a tree and was holding it like a baseball bat, her head tilted, waiting for Victoria to make a move. Victoria lowered her hand, her chest heaving with suppressed rage. "You are arrogant for a blood bag," she hissed. "But human lives are so very fragile. Accidents happen every day, Penelope. And children with unstable biology, well, sometimes even miracles expire." With a swirl of red silk, Victoria turned and vanished in a blur of vampiric speed. Penelope's heart pounded violently in her chest. The threat was not empty. The velvet prison was closing in, and the true monsters were finally showing their fangs. The threat Victoria left hanging in the garden air settled over Penelope like a suffocating blanket. She stopped sleeping entirely. She stationed a heavy armchair in front of the nursery door every night, a silver-plated fire poker resting against her wide thighs. She meticulously monitored every meal, every glass of water, and every interaction the twins had with the estate staff. But the most terrifying intrusion came not from an assassin, but from the king himself. It was a week after the garden incident. The estate was wrapped in the heavy darkness of 3 a.m. Penelope was sitting in the dimly lit nursery, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of Leo and Maya's chests. A sudden drop in temperature made the hairs on her arms stand up. Nathaniel materialized from the shadows. Wearing only an unbuttoned dark dress shirt, he looked raw and dangerously magnetic. "You should be resting," Nathaniel said, his voice a low hum. "I don't have the luxury of sleep," Penelope replied coldly. "Not when your fiancé is threatening to murder them." Nathaniel stepped fully into the room. "Victoria will not touch them. My personal guard watches the perimeter. They are safe. They will never be safe in a world that views their mother as livestock," Penelope shot back. "The moment their biology stabilizes, we are leaving." Nathaniel slowly closed the distance, stopping beside her chair. He looked down at her, his eyes tracing the soft curve of her cheek and the heavy rise and fall of her chest. Tentatively, he reached out his cold fingers, brushing her warm jawline. Penelope slapped his hand away. "Don't touch me!" A flicker of genuine pain crossed his ancient features. "Penelope, I was wrong 5 years ago. I was blinded by immortal arrogance. Watching you fiercely protect what is ours, I realize what I threw away. The softness of you, the warmth." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I have missed the weight of you in my bed. I have missed my queen." Once she would have given anything to hear those words. But the girl who loved him died freezing in the Boston snow. "I am the exact same fat human girl you threw out like garbage," Penelope said, standing up and forcing him back. "You don't get to crave me now just because I produce something you want. You are their father by biology only. To me, you are nothing but a warden." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. The rejection struck him harder than any physical blow. He turned sharply and vanished into the shadows, leaving Penelope trembling but unbroken. The real nightmare began 2 days later, on Tuesday morning, the day of the twins' weekly synthesized matrix infusion. Dr. Pendleton arrived at the East Wing with his rolling medical cart, accompanied by a new assistant, a young human thrall named Gregory, whose eyes darted around nervously. Penelope stood right beside the medical cot as Leo climbed up, rolling up his small sleeve. "The formula is particularly potent this week," Dr. Pendleton murmured, preparing the IV bag filled with the glowing ruby liquid. Penelope watched closely as the needle pierced Leo's arm. Maya stood by her mother's wide hip. For the first 30 seconds, everything seemed normal. Then Leo gasped. It wasn't a sigh. It was a sharp, agonizing choke. His small back arched off the cot. The veins extending from the IV site didn't glow red. They turned a violent, toxic black. "Mommy!" Leo choked out, his eyes rolling back. "It burns! Stop the IV!" Penelope screamed. She shoved Dr. Pendleton backward with her massive shoulder and ripped the needle out of Leo's arm herself. Thick, poisoned blood spilled onto the white sheets. Leo began to convulse, thrashing wildly. The monitors erupted into chaotic alarms. Maya screamed a piercing sound that shattered the glass windows. The heavy mahogany doors were ripped off their hinges. Nathaniel was there in a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with absolute terror. "What did you do?" Nathaniel roared, lifting Dr. Pendleton by the throat. "I don't know," Pendleton choked. "The matrix was sealed." "He's dying, Nathaniel," Penelope yelled frantically, holding Leo down. Nathaniel dropped the doctor and blurred to the cot. His immortal senses immediately picked up the sickly scent from the spilled matrix, wolfsbane, and crushed silver nitrate, a lethal poison designed to rot vampire cells and induce a fatal human heart attack. "The only thing strong enough to flush the poison is pure ancient blood," Nathaniel stated with lethal calm. He bit into his own wrist, thick black blood welling up. "Hold him still." Penelope threw her weight over Leo's legs, while Nathaniel pressed his bleeding wrist over Leo's mouth. "Drink, little wolf," Nathaniel commanded. For an agonizing minute, Leo choked. The black veins warred with the ancient magic of his father's blood. Slowly, the seizing stopped. The black veins faded to blue. Leo took a ragged breath, opening his father's exact blue eyes. Penelope collapsed against the cot, sobbing as she pulled Leo into her arms. Nathaniel stood up, his wrist healing instantly. His relief was immediately consumed by absolute wall-shaking wrath. He turned to the assistant Gregory, who was weeping against the wall. In a blur, Nathaniel pinned the thrall by the throat. "Who?" "Lady Victoria compelled me," Gregory sobbed. "She promised to turn me if I poisoned the bag." Nathaniel didn't say a word. With a sickening crunch, he snapped the thrall's neck, dropping the body to the marble floor. He turned to Penelope, who was shielding Leo fiercely. "Stay here," Nathaniel commanded, his voice echoing with the promise of absolute slaughter. He walked out, heading for the West Wing. The king was going to war. The West Wing of the Croft estate was a sanctuary of cold European elegance, but as Nathaniel breached its heavy oak doors, the air itself seemed to crackle and die. He did not walk. He was a storm of ancient, unstoppable violence sweeping through the corridor. The elite guards, stationed outside Victoria Laurent's private suite, took one look at their king's black, soulless eyes and immediately dropped to their knees, pressing their faces to the imported Italian marble floor in absolute, terrified submission. Nathaniel didn't bother using the brass handle. He kicked the heavy double doors with a physical force that splintered the thick mahogany into jagged flying shrapnel. Victoria was lounging on a plush velvet chaise, casually swirling a crystal glass of O-negative blood. She wore a sheer silver designer dressing gown that draped elegantly over her skeletal, fashionably gaunt frame. At the deafening crash of the doors, she jumped, spilling the thick crimson liquid down her pristine silk front. "Nathaniel, have you lost your mind?" she shrieked, though a triumphant gleam danced in her cold eyes. She assumed the human boy was already dead. She assumed she had won the war for the throne. In a fraction of a second, Nathaniel crossed the expansive, opulent room. He did not yell. He did not curse. He simply wrapped his large, pale hand entirely around Victoria's slender throat and hoisted her high off the floor. Her crystal glass shattered against the tiles, blending the stolen blood with the expensive rugs. "You touched my bloodline," Nathaniel whispered, his voice a horrifying, demonic hiss that vibrated with such frequency it caused the massive glass windows of the suite to spiderweb with cracks. Victoria clawed frantically at his iron grip, her legs kicking uselessly in the air. She is a human pig," Victoria choked out, her fangs descending in a desperate, panicked reflex as she tried to scratch his arm. "They are half-breeds. I am your equal. I am your true queen." "You are nothing," Nathaniel stated with lethal finality, his expression devoid of any mercy. "Penelope Higgins is the mother of the Croft dynasty. She possesses more strength in her mortal human heart than you have in your entire ancient hollow existence." With a brutal, effortless twist of his wrist, Nathaniel ripped the aristocratic vampire's head completely from her shoulders. Her immortal body instantly crumbled into a heap of expensive silk and grey ash, leaving only the sharp stench of burning ozone in the cold air. The threat was neutralized. The false queen was dead. When Nathaniel returned to the East Wing medical suite minutes later, his hands were lightly stained with ash, but his eyes had returned to their icy, piercing blue. He expected to find Penelope weeping in terror over her poisoned son. Instead, he found her standing tall, her broad shoulders squared casually, buttoning a thick woolen peacoat over her dark plum power suit. Leo was sitting up on the examination cot, the healthy color fully restored to his cheeks, thanks to Nathaniel's potent blood, while Maya held her brother's hand protectively. Flanking Penelope were two human figures who had just been escorted in by Nathaniel's deeply confused and terrified security detail, Dr. Richard Caldwell and Sarah Jenkins, Penelope's fiercely loyal friend and former senior lab technician from Massachusetts General Hospital. "What is the meaning of this?" Nathaniel demanded, the dark adrenaline of the kill still pulsing through his undead veins. "Why are there unauthorized humans in my secure wing?" Penelope turned to face him, her full round face an unyielding mask of pure authority. She was a heavy-set, profoundly beautiful, fierce force of nature, and she looked down at the terrifying king of the eastern seaboard without a single shred of fear. "This is the end of your dictatorship, Nathaniel," Penelope said, her voice ringing clear, steady, and loud enough to echo in the hallway. "For 5 years, while you sat in your penthouse, ruling through intimidation, Sarah and Dr. Caldwell were working on the biological samples I provided. They didn't just diagnose the twins, they cracked the sequence for the synthetic matrix before Croft Biogenetics even knew the formula existed." Sarah Jenkins, trembling under the Vampire King's gaze but incredibly resolute, suit, pulled a thick legal binder from her leather briefcase. "We secured the global patents 3 days ago under an independent human holding company, Higgins Biosolutions," Sarah stated, pushing her glasses up her nose. "We've already filed the binding paperwork with the US Patent and Trademark Office and the European Medicines Agency." Nathaniel stared at them, the absolute reality of the situation slowly dawning on his ancient, calculating mind. The sheer audacity of the move was staggering. He had underestimated human ingenuity, and far more importantly, he had underestimated a mother's wrath. "You patented the matrix. I own the formula," Penelope corrected, taking a heavy, confident step toward him, her sheer mass forcing him to hold his ground. "Your corporate labs manufacture it, but I control the intellectual property. Furthermore, I have drafted legally binding accords with the European covens. They know the heirs exist. They know I hold the key to their survival. If you ever try to lock us in a cage again, if you ever try to dictate how my children are raised, or if you ever threaten me, I will revoke Croft Biogenetics licensing rights. Your company will crash, your board of undead aristocrats will devour you, and your entire East Coast empire will burn to the ground." Shan. Nathaniel was utterly speechless. He looked at the fat human woman he had cruelly discarded in the freezing snow half a decade ago. She had not returned to his city to beg for his protection, nor had she come seeking his elusive love. She had meticulously orchestrated a hostile corporate takeover of his legacy to ensure her children's absolute safety. She had turned his own unimaginable wealth and corporate structure into a lethal weapon against him. It was the most brilliant, ruthless, and terrifying display of power he had witnessed in his long, blood-soaked millennium. A slow, dark smile spread across Nathaniel's handsome face, revealing the sharp glint of his fangs. The begrudging respect he had felt days ago instantly blossomed into an intoxicating, overwhelming reverence. He didn't just want her, he worshipped her. Slowly, gracefully, the immortal king of the East fell to one knee, bowing his dark head right in front of Penelope's practical leather boots. "You outplayed the king," Nathaniel murmured, his voice thick with raw, desperate devotion, as he reached out to press his cold lips against the back of her soft, warm hand. "You are not a prisoner, Penelope. You are the absolute architect of this empire. Whatever terms you demand, they are yours." Penelope looked down at the ancient monster who had once broken her heart, knowing she had finally tamed the beast. She pulled her hand back gently but firmly. She didn't forgive him, not yet. The long road to earning her heart would take him centuries of submission. But as she turned to look at Leo and Maya, who were watching their mother with wide, awestruck eyes, she knew she had secured their future forever. She was a heavy-set mortal woman in a treacherous world of immortal predators. But as she walked out of the medical suite with her children by her side, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Penelope Higgins was the only one truly wearing the crown. Thank you so much for watching this intense, dramatic finale. Penelope's incredible journey from a banished, heartbroken girl to a fierce, unstoppable queen proves that true power comes from a mother's love and brilliant resilience. If you loved this massive twist and enjoyed seeing the arrogant vampire king finally brought to his knees by our beautiful, curvy heroine, please hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with all your friends who love supernatural romance and female empowerment, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling original stories every single week.